lovely to be here. Now, about a year ago, at this exact conference, I said that we expected the second tranche of privacy reforms to land very soon. I said it with great confidence. This year, I might say it again, we really do expect the second tranche of privacy reforms to land soon. And look, next year, if I say the same, you can throw eggs at me. But I think it will happen. I think it'll happen within the next few months, but who knows. That said, we haven't had the legislative second chunk of changes happen, but a lot has been happening. We've had, or we have at the moment, a consultation going on the Children's Online Privacy Code, which is very significant. We've had the OAIC, the regulator's guidance on APP3, which is the Australian privacy principle that determines what a collection of data is. We've got at the moment a consultation going on automated decision making, which a lot of people think of as being an AI-based regulation. It actually isn't. It is broader than that. It relates to computer programs, so any automated decisions. Of course, that does include AI as well. Oh, sorry. It's just because I'm not tall enough, so it's actually at my eye line. So we will talk about those three things, but open to other areas as well this afternoon. Now, I have with me here Tanvi Mehta Krensel from the US law firm Squire Patton Boggs. I will let Tanvi introduce herself, but just to say she is a very rare breed, a lawyer who has worked in industry, dare I say it, TikTok, and really understands the commercial and the practical side of things as well as the legal side. So we're very lucky to have her here on stage. Tanvi,
Thank
over
you,
to you.
Sarah.
This
is working. This is working. I will will it into working, just like we will the Tranche 2 reforms to come to the Privacy Act. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for such a kind introduction. I'm a partner in the data privacy, cybersecurity, and digital assets team. The firm is indeed US-based. Actually, we have offices around the world, but I'm here in Sydney. And I do like to think I give quite practical advice, but you will be the judge of that after you see our chat today. So lovely to be here.
Okay. Gay, were you going to pitch in, or should we just kick off?
Yes.
Okay, fabulous.
Do you have the little clicker?
I do have the clicker.
Ah, wonderful.
And I might just take a seat while you're...
That's me. So I will click right past that. So this is what I'm going to spend a few minutes, hopefully just a few minutes, talking about today, what we have seen so far, and a little bit on what's to come. Sarah mentioned automated decision-making, which seems like a good place to start. The ADM changes to the Privacy Act actually were passed at the end of 2024. We're lucky we've had a long lead time. They're going to come into effect as part of the Tranche 1 reforms to the Privacy Act in December of this year. I feel like this is a moment where a picture tells 1,000 words. I don't think I have to say much, except that, for those who don't know, robo-debt, or the scandal arising from robo-debt, is, I believe, a large part of why these law reforms were made. But, as you alluded to, Sarah, they go much more broadly than robo-debt, particularly in that, as you will see, they don't just regulate public sector agencies, although they do and they should, and they don't just regulate the kinds of decisions which formed the basis of robo-debt, which was essentially the payment or requirement to pay back Centrelink amounts. Pretty clearly a significant decision. Okay. So this new reform will be introduced into Australian Privacy Principle 1, and I know not everyone knows the APPs like the back of their hand. I'm not even sure I do sometimes, but that is a provision that's all about about a few things, but particularly what needs to be included in your privacy policy. So, From the 10th of December, if you meet this threshold, certain requirements will apply. But I'll talk about the threshold first. If your organisation has arranged for a computer program, Sarah, you're right, computer program, no definition, but quite broad, and that use of arranged for is quite deliberate too. If you have not necessarily been the supplier who operates the technology, but arranged for that technology to be used, to make or do something substantially and directly related to making a decision, that's relevant, I'll come on to that. And that decision significantly affects individuals' rights and interests, probably of great interest to the room, so I'll speak to that in a minute too. And personal information is used when you operate the computer program, then voila, you have got new transparency requirements under your privacy policy. And specifically, you have to disclose what I've put on the screen. That last little chevron is just, it's actually drafting that's been taken exactly from the Act, but it's painful to read, but that is actually how it's drafted. Okay, what does this mean in practice? So I'm guessing the people that we have in the room broadly know GDPR or know of GDPR and the kinds of requirements that it imposes on people like us. This is a little bit different from GDPR. Under GDPR, you have a right to object to solely automated decisions that meet a particular threshold. You don't have that right here. They've taken the disclosure obligation from GDPR, but not that accompanying right. Actually, having spoken to the Privacy Commissioner, if you do think this is a toothless tiger, which I don't think it is, but you might, the point of this provision is to flush out the use of ADM by an organisation. So think of these next 6 months as your time to think about whether these decisions exist within your organisation, and if you need to, whether you're comfortable making disclosures about these decisions in your privacy policy, or if you want to maybe rejig things so you don't meet the threshold and the disclosures aren't required. We'll talk about this a bit later, but the threshold for this is actually also strangely, because we're a bit narrower than GDPR in some ways, but we've also learnt from GDPR here in Australia and decided that even though the GDPR requirements for transparency only apply where a decision is made solely by automated means, we're going to go a step further and say that if the decision is substantially, or rather if the action is substantially and directly related to make a decision, then that's enough. And that's really interesting, because it suggests to me that if you use a computer program or any form of AI for the sake of argument to produce any kind of recommendation about the kinds of people that you should target for a specific advert, and if a human reviews that but doesn't, I guess, materially change that recommendation or question that recommendation, you are potentially firmly in the scope of new APP 1.7 in a way that you might not be if you were in Europe. So that's interesting, that's a rub. Finally, individuals' rights and interests. So they have to be significant, don't they, to be affected? That's on that slide. Is advertising going to do that? That's the million-dollar question, because in some ways, and this is actually recognised by the OAIC, the targeting of contents and adverts may still have a significant effect, even, I know we in the room know how significant that effect could be potentially, if it results in differential pricing or provision of, differential pricing for the provision of significant goods or services. Significant good or service. I was reading the issues paper, Sarah, that the OAIC put out, and I think they've been a little bit deliberately ambiguous, because the example that they give is advertising which results in a higher price being payable in OAIC equivalent of Double Bay for a book than in a rural New South Wales town. And there might be good reasons for why that's the case, but it immediately led me to question whether access to a book, particularly in this day and age, is an essential service or a significant good or service. And I don't know the answer to that. I suspect that the issues paper will draw out some thinking on that point, but it's, if I can borrow JJ's phrase, it's a call to action, I think, to think about what would constitute a significant good or service, and whether automated advertising that imposes differential pricing might get you within the scope of 1.7. And as I alluded to, this applies even if the different pricing is justified. So a ride sharing or taxi service might rightly justify higher payment for a trip from the Sydney CBD than a trip from a Sydney suburb.
And Tanvi, if I can just break in there, because it's very interesting on that point about the particular sectors and which industry sectors will or may affect people's rights. The OAIC has pointed to some specific sectors, haven't they? So
that's
health,
correct.
Health is one. Financial services, I think, is another. Education is another. And I have a feeling that is a fourth. Jobs, which the OAIC will be looking at in particular.
Yes, that's correct. I was looking at my handy issues paper, but all of those things, I think access to banking and credit services, telco, essential utilities, these for me are the obvious examples. And still significant, but obvious. I am really interested in the fringe cases. I think the book example is one that I've been thinking about a lot, actually. But you're absolutely right. If any advertiser is covering those sorts of services and making automated decisions, then this applies. And just finally, the usual tension. The OAIC has been clear that the disclosures you make need to be meaningful and accessible, but also comprehensive. And that's one, I think, that privacy policies have not really gotten to the bottom of, how to make something really accessible and understandable by someone, but equally not making it so simple so as to dumb down the concept entirely. Not an easy job. Consent. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I won't spend too long on this, Sarah, because we do want questions and a chat. A lot has changed, even if it doesn't seem like it, even if we're all still waiting for tranche 2, which I was promised since when I returned from the UK to Australia in 2022, but I digress. Children's Online Privacy Code coming into effect in December. That will change the version of consent that applies for children, and I will talk about why that's important in a moment. Tranche 2, we're going to leave to one side, I think, but that will change the picture if and when it comes. OAIC enforcement, this is an interesting one. For those who've been following the OAIC's recent decisions, many of which have centred on whether collection of personal information is fair and reasonable, she's also been saying a lot, actually, if you listen, about consent. So, for example, in a recent enforcement action against a rent tech platform to apply, the Commissioner says that bundled consent is potentially not fair under the Privacy Act, which makes it illegal under Australian Privacy Principle 3. It's not a decision that's about consent necessarily, but I think it's a good indicator that she sees consent as being a more balanced and more express process than perhaps it has been seen in the past. So key message, things are changing now, even if they might not always seem as obvious as a complete reform of the Privacy Act. I won't spend time on this, but this is the definition or the different elements, I should say, of consent under the Children's Privacy Code. So this is the threshold of consent that you need if you are dealing with children in a way that requires their consent, including if you're direct marketing to them. Probably the one significant change from the OAIC's guidelines, which also require all of these things on consent, is that consent can also not be obtained through coercion, manipulation, and a way that substantially impedes an individual's ability to consent. Don't know what you think about, but I think about dark patterns there. I think about any sort of nudging or confirmed shaming of a particular outcome in a way that particularly, I do think it's particularly relevant with kids, that encourages them to pick a pink box over a black box.
Yeah. There. I was at an event yesterday listening to and it was a publicly reported event, listening to the ACCC Commissioner speak, along with Minister Andrew Lee. And they talked about the issue of manipulation and what that meant. They were actually talking in the context of the new consumer terms amendments that are coming in. But it was interesting to hear them throw around this idea of, what manipulation meant. And, the conclusion was you couldn't have a reasonable manipulation. There is something negative about the word manipulation. But there was an interesting discussion about the dividing line between persuasion, which obviously has always been, at the core of advertising and many legitimate business activities, where manipulation starts. It's an interesting debate.
And it's interesting too, because you're absolutely right. The consumer law will start to regulate this kind of conduct as well. And I do, worry is the wrong word, but I do wonder how the two regimes will be interoperable, particularly because you're dealing with different aged people and slightly different concepts of, exactly as you say, what manipulation or coercion means. So there's something to be said there, I think, about a very crowded field, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something to be aware of. Sorry, just quickly, the reason the code is important, and I know many of you already know because you may be, or you may be acting for someone who advertises to children for a brand who does, or whether you advertise to kids or not, you may still be caught by the code, which I'll talk about. But I think even if the code doesn't directly apply to you, it's worth noting, and I heard the Privacy Commissioner say this recently, it's a bit obvious, children grow up, don't they? So whatever standards today's children grow up with as set under this code will, like it or not, influence their expectations of privacy as adults. Which is why I do think the fact that we have a code that's developed, I think, far beyond, probably everyone would agree, the Privacy Act is difficult. But this is why it's important, I think, even if you're not dealing with children now, it may still influence your relationships with customers and your audience in the future. Okay. I won't spend too long on this either. Really just some developments in the law, including the consumer law development that you mentioned, Sarah. I think a lot of these will be part of our fireside chat, but just one to note on pixel tracking for those in the room who are interested, which I expect is many of you. The requirements now around well, they always were the requirements, but as made clear in the OASC's guidance, if you are collecting sensitive information through the use of pixels, then you really need an individual's consent. And it's funny, I think, okay, sensitive information, that's health information. How often is that going to affect people in the room? But the Commissioner gives an example of setting a pixel which reports back on your visit to a mental health website as potentially sensitive information. We've seen in the UK, Lloyd's Pharmacy share very similar data with the pixel of certain social media platforms, including search terms on things like weight loss, which, I think that's a bit of an interesting case there, because I'm not sure that is health information, but in some hands it could be. So just a little word of warning from me that we'll see enforcement action, I think, in the next few weeks, but that concept of sensitive information might not be as narrow as at least I initially thought it would be. Gosh, there's almost too much to say about APP3, but I will try. So the Privacy Principle 3 governs what personal information you can collect as a marketer, as an agency, and how you can collect it, essentially in a way that is reasonably necessary for your functions and activities. I suppose that's the answer to what, and the answer to how is in a way that is lawful and fair. We will get on to APP3, I'm almost certain, throughout today, so I won't spend much time talking about it, except to say that the reason I included new in inverted commas in the heading is because I don't actually think this is new guidance. Well, I don't think this is new law. I think what's happened is the OAIC has taken a number of enforcement decisions recently on APP3. She's distilled principles from those decisions and put them in one place, which is why APP3 looks the way that it does. And while its significance shouldn't be understated, and while I think it's almost certain that the Commissioner will use this in the enforcement action that she takes in the future, It is just worth noting that it's still guidance at this point. It can be challenged. Actually, quite a lot from this guidance, particularly on what's fair, has been taken from the same rent tech decision that I mentioned, which I found out today is being appealed. So that's worth noting. And the other point that's worth noting is that there's a lot there that, whether it's subject to appeal today or not, probably will be challenged by the courts, or at least overseen by the courts and tribunals. So do take this as a significant development, but watch the space, as I know you all will, with interest. And that's me.
Thank you, Tanvi.
I'm going to stand up here because you
need
guys
to
look
raise
very
the
comfortable.
microphone, though, Gail.
Very comfortable there. And I'm not going to spend too long on the fireside because you've covered a lot together and you're a great double act. You don't really need me. But I'll ask a few things and then please, we'd love to hear from the floor because stuff is hard to get your head around, not only because it's law, but also trying to work out the use cases in our ecosystem and really pinpointing what would be compliant and what's not, because getting a straight lawyer out of either the government or lawyers can be hard. So we're going to try and probably do a little bit of that today. But I guess let's just start with the children's code, because that was, I think, to a lot of people a bit of a surprise in terms of how it came to market, and particularly that I guess default situation that presuming everyone is a child to a certain extent. What do you think, I guess, the most difficult and contentious issues will be for, let's keep it to the room, like particularly publishers and media owners in the ecosystem in terms of operating? Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to start with that.
Yeah, look, I think probably the biggest threshold issue is who it applies to. And the code at the moment, as a lot of you probably know, say it applies to services that are likely to be accessed by children. But at the moment, there isn't really much more guidance on that. So that leaves businesses in a situation where they are not always sure. Accessed by children, what does that mean? It doesn't go to, it can be very hard to assess. The other problem that businesses might have when they're looking at that is, well, how do I know whether my service is likely to be accessed by children unless I collect data about my users, and then I'm collecting personal information, which I'm not allowed to do if they're children. So you've got a circularity there, which is potentially problematic. So I think that is the first contentious point. I think the second one, I'll be very quick, but it is significant, is that the only personal information you are allowed to collect under the Children's Code by default, so that's without a setting that your user turns on, is information that is strictly necessary. And that is much narrower than what we currently have under the Australian privacy principles, which allows you to collect a much broader range of personal information. So, the real-time impact of whether your service is or is not caught by this code is really significant.
And for the members in the room, which hopefully most of you are, Sarah's done a fantastically detailed submission on this on behalf of the industry, so feel free to have a read through that, recognising the importance of this topic, but still explaining, how difficult some of these areas might be to meet for industry. And, the intent is we are compliant and we want to be compliant, but it needs to be workable. Tanvi, I don't know if you had anything to add.
Wholly agree with that. I would add that, particularly for the brands in the room, that if you are caught by the code, or you take the view that it would be best to apply the requirements of the code from a risk basis, you will need to undertake a kind of age assurance before people visit your online service. And I'm so sick of saying the words age assurance, because they've been two new, they've been obviously the social media pause that passed last year, but also for those who are caught by them, the online safety codes that came into effect in March that regulate access to things which are lawful but awful, as they call them, things that kids can't see but are still lawful. This is a third age assurance obligation, and I think there's real questions probably amongst brands in the room and industry as to how to for the lucky ones of you who are caught by all three of those laws, how to meaningfully implement age assurance that deals with the three laws that regulate quite different subject matter area. Age assurance now, as drafted, also, it's worth noting, means taking reasonable steps to ascertain the age of every end user. So it doesn't just mean a child and whether they are 16 or 14, it also means me and whether I'm 39 or 40. And I think that's a huge level of detail that probably goes beyond the two other laws which I mentioned, which are more focused on whether you're 16 and under or 18 and under. This is now requiring age to be ascertained with a reasonable degree of granularity. That's a lot. That's a lot of information. And just finally, Gay, also the restrictions around direct marketing in the code, I would be remiss not to mention them. It seems like the OAIC intends for them to govern targeted advertising as well as other forms of direct marketing that have been more conventionally, I think, interpreted as direct marketing under the law. At present, if you want to conduct direct marketing, it needs to be in a child's best interests. The information that you use needs to be collected directly from a child, and you need to have either theirs or, depending on their age, a parent or carer's consent to conduct that direct marketing. It's not quite a prohibition, but there's a lot of hoops to jump through there, and particularly that concept of best interests. Sarah, I'd love to read your submission on this, because there's almost an assumption, I think, in the code that best interests means protecting a child's privacy. I think it does. But children also have other rights, like the right to freedom of expression, the right to information. I think a lot of thought will have to go into when advertising how those rights interact, particularly depending on what it is that you are advertising.
I can't even get my head around some of the age assurance stuff along with the new APP3 guidance in terms of that inference, because it feels like you'd need some of that to do the latter. I want to bring it right back to the people in this room, what we can do now, and happy to have questions after that. So we've got a whole lot of new advice, guidance, things in play. If you were sitting in this room at the moment, either a marketer, agency or media owner, what would you be prioritising right now? And I think we've been saying for the last few years, everyone needs an audit. Presume you've all done that now, hopefully. Sarah, what's
look, I think data minimisation. That is a data minimisation and data deletion once your use has finished. That is a thread that is flowing fairly consistently through things that are coming from government, things that are coming from the regulator. And I think it's fairly safe to say that, you know, if you are not minimising the data you collect, if you are not deleting it when the purpose you collected it for has ended, that there is a risk that that will not be considered reasonable or fair and reasonable, perhaps, if we get that in tranche 2. So I think that's one, and that is a relatively, I shouldn't say relatively easy because nothing's easy, but I mean it is at least a simple concept. Only collect what you need and get rid of it safely when you don't need it anymore. The other thing I would say, and this has been something that I've been mulling over since listening to something that the ACCC Commissioner said publicly recently, on the subject of the type of legislation, and she was talking about what we call principles-based legislation, but that's essentially legislation where there is a principle and then the regulator has some level of discretion on how, the detail of how it is implemented. And she made a comment that this type of principles-based regulation was really the only way that regulation could keep up with technology changes. Which I think is very interesting because that does start to explain why we are seeing things like the APP3 guidance coming out of a regulator, where we are seeing changes in approach and shifts in approach without an accompanying change in the overriding law. So I think the takeout point for that is keep watching, even if, even once we have tranche 2, even when we are not aware of any Privacy Act legislative reform on the horizon, guidance notes, ways of implementing existing law, I think is going to be increasingly important. Just because you did something last year and it was okay, will not mean it's okay to do it this year, even if the law remains the same.
Great, thank you. Tanvi.
Yeah, for me, I hear consent talked about a lot in the marketing and advertising, in the pixel tracking space as well. And just a reminder to those in the room that while places like the UK and the EU are quite bound, I think, by consent when conducting certain kinds of advertising, we are not in Australia. There are some notable exceptions, like pixel tracking involving sensitive information. But as you can hopefully see from my presentation, the requirements around consent are getting stricter, but equally, we have principles-based privacy legislation. There are other bases on which to use non-sensitive information, so many caveats here, when marketing to people who are not children, right? That is still possible. So for those in the room who are thinking that the new consent requirements are really onerous, maybe it's also worth thinking about other bases that you might have to handle personal information and whether they can be made out in a way that perhaps consent can't. So some thoughts I had would be collecting data through logged in environments, making the value exchange when you collect data very clear and notifying people of the consequences of collection and what that means for them. Potentially also thinking about profiling in a way that's more progressive rather than pulling together lots of data at once. I'd be thinking about what I would say to a regulator if that marketing practice was called into question. I wouldn't necessarily just be focusing on whether consent is made out or not. And then secondly, we didn't talk very much about APP3, which is partly on me and timing, but a few things that came out of the updated guidance. One, any interaction with data, whether it's enrichment or augmentation, anything else in the ecosystem can now, according to the OAIC, constitute collection. Data brokers are potentially a no-no because we can't make out that collecting data for enrichment via a data broker is necessary under APP 3.6. Two entities can collect data at the same time. This is a new world, I think, and what it suggests to me, and I would say this because I'm a lawyer, but I'm still going to say it, is we need contracts. I mean, this is a complicated ecosystem, and I'm sure that there are already contracts in place. But if they say something like, you are required to give notice as required by law, I just don't think that's good enough anymore. I think you need to really delineate who is responsible for notice, who's responsible for consent if you need it, but also things like, well, if the original data that was used as the basis of enrichment was wrong, well then who is responsible for correcting that and passing those corrections up the chain? Who is responsible for deletion, as you rightly said as well, Sarah? I think that actually papering these relationships and being quite thoughtful in your approach to these relationships is another way, not of passing the buck necessarily, but making sure that privacy obligations are met by the right people in the ecosystem.
Brilliant. Thank you. JJ, have we got time for a question or two? Got Dan out the front here.
Do you want to go first, JJ? Yeah. You started off talking about GDPR. I think that's important because Australia usually takes a lot of reference from the UK, the Privacy Commissioner's Office, the ICO, etc. But if we look at the Children's Privacy Code that's proposed, it's actually a big departure from the risk-based model which they use over there, determining whether it's a high, medium or low risk to a child who's accessing a website or an app. So like the likely to be accessed factor has been applied as a very broad sort of blanket with not much guidance on that threshold. And when you break down the incremental costs of compliance, so age assurance or consent or other privacy and security, a website or app of up to 1 million monthly active users could be footing a bill of between 300,000 to 1 million in the first year. And it keeps going up and up. So there's a big cost, incremental cost of compliance there. Do you think that the Australian government and what it's proposed is is departing deliberately from what the UK has done here, or is it just an oversight?
I will say that I'm really looking forward to seeing the submissions once they're made public by, no doubt, members in this room and by Sarah, because I think the point that you've made, Brian, will be touched on in many of those submissions. I suspect, so the UK, as you say, has an age-appropriate design code. I'm trying to think of what to say and being diplomatic about it. I think a lot has been taken from the age-appropriate design code, but just like the ADM provision that I mentioned, where it has suited to depart and take an approach that's maybe better aligned with Australian interests, I don't think there's been hesitation in doing that as well, and that is anticipated. I think when the OAIC first announced this code, they did say, we'll use the AADC as inspiration, but don't expect it to be a copy-paste. The other thing I'm interested in, which is maybe the converse of what you just said, is there are concepts in the code which really come from GDPR, like the best interests of the child, and these new concepts, I think, around consent and targeted advertising that don't necessarily align with the APPs and the Privacy Act. So I don't know what you think, Sarah, but I feel like whichever way you look at it, there are some deviations from the source material, and I wonder how many of those will be questioned and potentially adjusted.
I mean, one sentence, because I know we're short of time, but yeah, it's a really good point. I think the similarities and the differences between the proposal and the UK Age Assurance Design Code will definitely be the subject of much debate in the submissions. And I think part of it is not just, I mean, as Tanvi said, the OAIC did openly say there will be some novel provisions in it, and there are, but there are also some protective factors in the AADC that are not appearing in the Children's Online Privacy Code. So I think it's definitely a watch this space.
Brilliant. I think we have to wrap up.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. Thank you.